There's a fine balance between restoring a motorcycle and walking away from one that's a little bit too far gone. And in today's video, I want to discuss how I and how you guys perhaps should consider walking away or restoring a motorcycle. If you're looking to purchase, which one should you do? What should you look at? What to consider? And how do I do it? I bought a handful of barn find and project bikes over the years, and today I just want to share how I decide whether a bike is worth it or whether a bike is something that I should walk away from or even look at in the first place. The biggest key deciding factor and the very first thing I consider and look at is what model the motorcycle is. Some motorcycle models are just going to be more desirable than others, and that's going to mean that the parts are usually going to be worth more, and the end result is going to have the motorcycle be worth more or at least be a much easier sell at the end of the day. If we look at something like a GS550, for example, I owned a 77 GS550. I got a great deal on the motorcycle, but it wasn't in the best shape. If I spent $1,000 and repainted everything, got the bike looking proper, put a proper fender back on the motorcycle, I would never get that money back. I would be sinking money into a motorcycle that wouldn't be worth it because there unfortunately just aren't enough people out there who want that bike. And at the same time, they're not worth all that much. I bought the bike for close to $1,000. You can get a really clean one for about $2,000, and sometimes even around $1,500 you can get a nicer one. So if you do spend $1,000 on the bike, or even $1,500, you're $2,500 into the bike, you're most likely never going to get that because there's no demand, and you've spent more than the bike is worth. Now that's not always the case, and there's a lot of different variables you have to look at, and the following variables are the things that I consider. Number one, the very first thing when I actually ask a question about the bike after deciding whether the bike model is worth it or not, is if the bike has a title, if the engine turns over, and if there's compression in the engine. A title for the motorcycle that matches the bike is very important for vintage motorcycles. I would say there's a big portion of bikes out there that don't have matching titles, and there's an even bigger portion of bikes out there that don't have titles whatsoever. Now there are several methods of obtaining a title. None of them are super clean, and none of them are super cheap either. There used to be a loophole that you used to be able to go to Vermont, pull registration, and be able to register it in your state, but many, if not all states, have closed that loophole, so they just make it really hard for you to pay registration tax and title. It makes no sense to me why these states don't just implement a thing for vintage motorcycles and vintage cars to say, hey, if you've got a VIN number and if it's clean, you can just go get a title, but they don't do that for some reason. So you're most likely looking at $5,000 to $1,000 to get the motorcycle titled again. If anyone knows any alternative or cheaper ways, let me know. So a title is very important because if you don't have a title, it drastically reduces the price of the motorcycle and should drastically reduce the price of you purchasing the motorcycle. It's hard to get a title, but not impossible. Most of the time you're gonna end up with a bonded title, and that also doesn't bring the whole value most of the time. You know, you might be able to get the full value sometimes, but it's gonna be a harder sell to get the bike gone. The next thing is you want to make sure that the engine turns over most of the time, unless you're getting an absolutely screaming deal on a motorcycle that's super rare or something like that. If you're looking for a restoration project, if the engine is seized and locked up, I would tend to walk away from it. That's not to say that's always going to be the case. Sometimes when you're restoring a motorcycle, you're going to want to rebuild the engine anyways. But usually if it's seized up, it's not going to be something that is going to be too easy to open up, and you're going to have to do a rebuild on the engine. When we're talking about Hondas and things like that, usually if they're not seized, they can fire right up. Let's just be honest. If a Honda CB isn't seized, there's a very, very high chance it's just going to start. I don't like to mess with seized bikes. I do have a couple of motorcycles that are theoretically seized up. There are ways to unseize them, and you can do that, but it's a headache that most people just aren't willing to take. Again, unless it's a super rare model and the engine's a numbers matching engine or something like that, I don't think it's usually worth unseizing an engine, other than just pure entertainment factor, to be honest with you. But there's one thing I need to interrupt this video with. We have officially dropped these rotary hats. You guys have been seeing me wear these for almost a year now, along with our house tees and stickers. Usually you can find engines for a lot of the larger production motorcycles that are out there. And the more important thing is, if the engine does turn over, does it have compression? If it doesn't have compression, again, you're gonna have to rebuild the engine because you need compression in order for it to run properly. Most of the time time the owners don't know what they're talking about. So, you know, I bought a motorcycle that said it had a seized engine, and the engine was sitting on the side. I brought it home, and I kicked it, and the engine wasn't seized at all. It also had compression. But I also showed up to purchase some motorcycles and was told the bike had compression. I kicked it over and it didn't have any compression whatsoever. So making sure that the engine's internals are properly working for me is always a very key thing. Because I can do the service work and all of those things for resto or revival, but when we're talking about pulling an engine out, sometimes it's not worth it, and especially in some of the models like a CB450 or something like that. Doing an engine teardown just isn't in the budget usually, and it doesn't make sense to do when I could just go buy a nice one instead. You also do have to consider your time into it, and I will say that now, you have to consider your time. You know, even if you're doing it for fun, even if you're not looking to make money out of it, at the end of the day, if you're just looking to get yourself a nice running bike, you know, you could be doing other things with your time. If you have a lot of spare time on your hand, maybe you don't consider your time, but, you know, usually I like to consider, like, you know, not shop hours or anything like that, but hey, I'm going to be putting time and effort into this motorcycle. I enjoy doing it, but is it something that I would want to do, or would I rather have, you know, just a nice one for the same price? Most of the motorcycles I buy, I tend to buy ones that have the engine that's turnover, and they simply need some minor things. My CB750 Supersport, for example, the bike I rode at home, but it had the wrong seat on it. It had the wrong tank color. It had the wrong side cover colors. So those minor things, if I was to change them out, wink, wink, the bike will be worth so much more money. And yeah, I'm going to be spending about $1,000 painting it, changing the seat, and fixing a couple of the things, but I bought it so cheap that the bike's in fully running operational condition, and a nice paint job on it will go a very long way for its value. I will instantly get that money back. That video should be coming soon. If you're not subscribed, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more videos. And while you're there, you might as well leave a like on it. I mean, it helps more people see videos like this. But when I actually get there and after deciding everything, the biggest thing of the parts that are on the bike and the thing about the motorcycle is originality. Is the original tank there? The original wheels? The original, like, foot pegs? The original, like, any weird thing that might be going on with the bike? Like a Goldwing, for example, their head covers are different from year to year. The side covers on a motorcycle matter because you have to source those things, and they're usually not too cheap. And if you have a rare motorcycle, they're usually going to be a little bit harder to find. So you want to make sure that all of the original pieces are there for the bike, even with the original exhaust. Even though you might not want to have the original exhaust on the bike, it is very nice to have it, because when we're talking about vintage bikes, original exhausts bring money. There's not a lot of them out there. People didn't take care of their bikes, so then they rot out. Is the original carburetor setup still on the bike? Is the original point system still on the bike? Has it been swapped to CDI? Has it been modified with the CDI? You know, whatever the case is, whatever the bike had from the factory, does it have it, and what has been changed? It's not to say that you necessarily want to go back to the factory settings, but it's nice to know what's been done and have the original parts. Because modifications in the motorcycle world, or even the car world, don't necessarily add value. But for motorcycles and vintage bikes in particular, sometimes, if not all the time, they can detract from the value of the motorcycle, and all original bikes are worth more money. Almost all the time. So you have to keep in mind how original is the bike, and, you know, where are the values for an original example of one of the bikes. The next thing to do is just a basic walk around of the bike. This is a very important part of where do I walk away from it. If the engine's seized up, I would tend to walk away from it. If the tank is decaying on the inside, just know tanks are very hard to clean out. I've learned that throughout the last couple of years, and it's about $1,000 to get a rusty tank coated properly and cleaned out. So you gotta keep that in mind. Sometimes they're not worth it, and sometimes you can get yourself a tank that is in nice condition. But not only that, you gotta consider what the motorcycle is going to need to get running again or in proper condition. If you're looking to buy a bike for a full resto, that doesn't matter as much if you're looking for a bike as a partial resto. A partial resto might entail cleaning the carburetors out, maybe doing a paint job, maybe changing the wheels, the tires, brakes, things like that. Minor services plus some cosmetic things to make it look a little bit better. So when you're considering doing a minor restoration, it is very important that the motorcycle is extremely solid. The bones of the bike are extremely good. When you're doing a full-on resto, they can be a little like, needs this, but, you know, just knock them down on price a little bit. When you're doing a partial resto, you need to have the proper things there, because that's when it starts to get expensive, and usually, if the bike only needs that partial restoration, it's going to be more expensive when you first buy it. So you need to have all of the minor things there, like all the original parts, all the original equipment for the motor, all of the equipment that requires the motor to run. The tank to not be super rusty on the inside. You also want to make sure the motorcycle rolls semi-decently and hasn't been dropped and the forks aren't bent and all of those good basic service things. You know, I would limit the bike to only having a couple of problems. It needs some minor servicing, maybe it has a bent wheel. Maybe it has a bent fork. Maybe the brakes are missing. Maybe the carburetors are missing. I wouldn't have all of those issues going on at the same time, especially if, you don't really know what you're doing. Because the more variables you add, the more price you add to the end total. So when should you walk away? And well, in my opinion, as long as you want to go look at it and it is what you thought it was, you're most likely going to be fine. But if you start poking around and the owner starts saying things and it's not represented quite as it was, you might want to walk away from the bike depending on the situation. Hopefully this information gave you a little bit more of the details and how I go through the thought process of getting a bike, acquiring a bike, and purchasing it for restoration. I hope you guys have found some information in this. If you did, leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next video.